Hello, what's up? Good day, and welcome to another episode of the ArenaCraft podcast, a show focused exclusively on Magic the Gathering Arena. I'm one of your hosts, Arjuna. I am joined today, as per usual, with Covert Go Blue, the one and the only one in Best of One. CGB 1-1, Best of One. How are you doing, CGB?
I want to clarify that there are many people who play Best of One. And I'm not the only person playing the format, no matter what the tryhards want to accuse me of. But I am, being the one in Best of One is about rising above the noise, above the crowd, standing alone. That's what it's about. But there are many. If I were the 1-1 in Best of One, it would be much less worthy of celebration. It would kind of take the whole character into a lonely direction. You know what I mean?
E pluribus unum. That's CGB right there. But yes, hello, and we are just like recovering. I think is the correct term, from the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, where typically vast quantities of food are consumed. A lot of streamers, I think, probably haven't taken some time off this week, but I definitely have, and it's been pretty wonderful. Just want to give you a quick overview of this episode. We have the Zendikar Rising... What's the official name of it? The Zendikar Rising Special Championship.
Zendikar Rising Players Pro Tour Mythic Invitational Standard Historic Mixed Format World Championship.
Wow.
No, it's the Zendikar Rising Champ. That's it.
The Mythic Special Pro Player Zendikar Championship, which is coming up basically the weekend after you listen to this. So we're going to be talking about what our expected metagames are in both formats, historic and standard. So that's going to be the majority of the discussion this week. Before we get to that, just, like a little personal check-in. How was your holiday, CGB?
I had a really good Thanksgiving. Thanks for asking. My wife and I stayed home. Now that I know that a lot of people are like, wow, that's your restraint is incredible. That's not it at all. We've been waiting to do this for years. We've lived in our house where we live now in northern Michigan for 8 years. We have never, ever had Thanksgiving dinner in our own home. Not once. Not the year we moved in. Not even. You know why? Because we are the weirdos in the family without kids. And when you have kids, you cannot, like brothers and sisters with children, you cannot get away with, hey, why don't you guys travel and come see us?
Yeah.
Never going to happen.
Why don't you buy double the plane tickets and go to all the hassle to fly out to my house? Yeah, makes sense.
For a lot of them, it's a drive too, but it's never going to happen. If we don't have kids and they have kids, we go to them. End of story. Plus the parents, the parents still want that beautiful Thanksgiving memory of having their children come visit them on Thanksgiving. So there's a tug of war between which sibling had the most recent child and which parents we didn't go see last year, And so we have never, not once, stayed home, had Thanksgiving in our own house, made the food we want to make, which isn't as traditional for Thanksgiving food. For example, my wife asked what I wanted. I was like, I want little smoky sausages wrapped in real thick cut bacon, just dumped in brown sugar. And she's like, you got it. And I'm like, yeah. And my wife hates stuffing, and I don't like stuffing either. So she filled her turkey with bread pudding.
Bread pudding?
Bread pudding.
Now, when I think about bread pudding, I'm thinking of like that real sweet dessert.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing this is something a little different? Oh, no.
No, not really.
No, it was... Okay, so it's a turkey stuffed with dessert. That's just
yes,
a full course meal in one dish. I love it.
Yep, just stuffed with apples and cinnamon and oh my goodness, it was amazing and it worked out. She couldn't even find. She even looked online for this and was like, nobody's ever done this before. It could go terribly wrong, but it went terribly right.
Yeah, it sounds like two delicious things put together. So, unless something does actually go wrong, that's usually a recipe for good things.
I also streamed. I streamed on Thanksgiving, which is the first time I've ever done that. And it was actually really fun. Spent it with my streaming community family instead of the usual place. And people were very grateful to have something to watch. Yeah, my stream was labeled the football and turkey alternative. And it went very well. It was a good show.
That's awesome. Awesome. And you were, of course, streaming a food deck.
Yes. I went on an absolute rampage with mono green food. Just feasting, troll, kinging everything in sight. Just got into like top 200 mythic before the end of it. It was a good run.
Love it. Just stacking up that bread pudding. Well, I think what I gathered from this CGB is that the covert go couple is deciding to go tall instead of wide with Thanksgiving this year. So good on you. Love it.
Thanks. How about you, man? What did you do?
Yeah, my Thanksgiving, I live in a house with some housemates, and we were trying to be as responsible as possible, so it was just us, just the fam. And I had one of the most amazing Thanksgiving meals of my life. I live with a number of people who are surprisingly good at cooking things. It always blows my mind because I'm not, even when I'm trying to be, my food's just like so, whatever. So I was tasked with the roast vegetables, which are kind of hard to mess up. But yeah, it was a culinary experience. One of my housemates is a hunter, and so he's like super into, like high quality meat. And so we had venison instead of turkey. My first time ever eating venison, and I really liked it. It's like really a very mild and somewhat gamey meat, but feels very clean and didn't put me into a food coma the way other red meat usually does.
Yep.
So that was really nice, and had a deer heart gravy, which was also the most amazing gravy I've ever eaten in my life. So it was like a real kind of, I live in Oregon, and it was definitely a real kind of like Oregon organic country hippie kind of a meal, just like really high quality food, cranberry sauce made from scratch. Yeah, it was one of the finer meals I've ever eaten, and I had a wonderful time. And I basically just CTFO'd and did hardly anything. So, yeah, it was a good time. This Thanksgiving holiday has some troubling genesis as far as where it comes from, but when you celebrate it with your friends in style, it can be very nice indeed.
Definitely agree.
Yeah, so cool. All right, well, let's dive into our discussion about magic, because that is definitely what you guys came here to talk to listen to this week. And so we're going to start off with what I hope will be just a brief overview of what we expect the historic metagame to look like going into this tournament, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about standard and talk about what's happening there.
And to give people maybe we're giving them a peek behind the curtain, but in order to divvy up podcast responsibilities, we put Arjuna in charge of pulling up historic decks and finding talking points, and I'll be handling the standard talking points. So we'll just be tossing it back and forth here.
Excellent. So one of the main source materials that I'm looking at here for our historic metagame is the most recent large-scale historic tournament which happened, which was the Caldheim Championship Qualifier on the SCG Tour. So this was a 5K tournament, not like a massive prize pool, but, definitely substantial enough to give us some kind of an idea. And so one of the things that I like the most in looking at the results of this tournament is that it's just a very, very diverse metagame. It's like I'm looking down the top 8 here, and I see there might only be one deck with more than one copy in the top 8, and that's Rack Sack. So just like a very, very cool... I think, Historic is just a really cool metagame right now. One of the reasons for that is that I think the general consensus is it just hasn't been solved. I will say that it has been a difficult format to solve, which probably points towards it being a fairly good, diverse, and balanced format. I think if there was any one particular archetype that was super dominant, I think we'd probably know it by now. But I think Wizards has done a pretty good job of like banning the Omnaths of the world and, you know, banning the Wilderness Rex of the world and actually giving this format a chance to really like stretch its wings and be diverse and interesting. And so in that regard, I think it's actually it's starting, you know, as time goes on, I think Historic is starting to look more and more like the modern format, which it frequently gets compared to. And that's a good thing, because Modern has been in a pretty good place for years, barring, you know, a few printings of ridiculous cards that went on to get banned. But apart from that, it has been this kind of format where, like, people play what they like, and there are, you know, like, even perhaps tens of decks that could spike a tournament or just, like, have a good weekend or get you really high on the Mythic ladder. I don't know. That's just kind of my overview of Historic before we dive into the specifics. Does that kind of track with you, CGB?
I agree completely, and I think it's very interesting that we have a format that's this powerful, but bordering on balanced, in that as long as you pick one of the best, most powerful decks and prepare for the matchups you really want to win, you can probably succeed. And maybe that's what we were supposed to have in Standard. Although, just even speculating about that, you know, before all the bans, like Eldraine Full Power Standard was supposed to just be OP at all times. But I don't know. That we're pretty far from that. But it's amazing how it's actually working out for Historic.
Yeah, it is. It really is. So let's get into the details here. The first thing that I want to point out here is that the dust is somewhat settling on the Kaladesh release. And I think that we can all agree that Kaladesh has had ultimately a subtle effect on the Historic format. It's definitely introduced some good cards such as Fatal Push, such as Bomat Courier to the format, which are definitely doing work, definitely earning their keep, definitely being worthy of inclusion. And of course, the fast lands are showing up everywhere. So that's really, really wonderful. But as far as, like, you know, there haven't been any basically archetype shattering inclusions that anyone has really come up with yet in Historic. So if you were somewhat familiar with the format before, like, for example, the previous massive championship that Seth Manfield took down, then you'll be fairly familiar with the way it's looking right now. There have been a few things that caught my eye as far as advancement in power level. One of them being that I think the Auras deck is now... You can make a good argument for that deck being a tier 1 deck in the format. I think in the past it was only really tier 1 and best of 1, but a lot of people have been playing it lately and it's been holding up. Like, for example, Wenzel Krautmann came in 3rd place playing Azorius Auras this SCG championship, and I just think that that is, like, something to note. Now, granted, it was somewhat of a spike. I don't see... as I'm going down the list here, I don't see another copy of that deck in the top 25. So, you know, maybe that was just an anomaly. But I have heard various people, such as, you know, Arjuna favorite Michael Jacob, discussing that as, like, one of the 4 decks he's considering playing at the championship. So I just think that's really cool. And let's just bring this one up. So we're going to start in number 3, just because this seems like the most kind of outstanding archetype to me in the list. This deck is a Luris deck, basically opting to go blue-white instead of Orzhov, the way a lot of people have been playing the deck lately. I've been hearing this rumblings of people saying that they think that the Azorius version is better than the Orzhov version, which I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on.
Dude, I was going to ask you.
Okay, right on. Well, let's just kind of take a quick look at the deck list here. So this is definitely a core Spirit Dancer deck. That's I'd say Luris and the Spirit Dancer are kind of the cards that are really bringing up the power level of this deck and making it basically a viable deck, regardless of which version you play. The supporting cast are 4 Alcid of Life's Bounty. We've got 3 Selfless Savior, 3 Hushbringer main, which is interesting. I've seen some Hushbringers in these lists, but 3 seems surprising to me. So that was definitely a metagame read there. 2 copies of SRAM Senior Edificer, which looks like it could be the only Kaladesh card that's really making a big splash in this list, but an important card for sure. And then, of course, you have your suite of enchantments. So this person's running 4 ofs of All That Glitters, Curious Obsession, and Cartouche of Solidarity. And then we have 3 ofs of Cartouche of Knowledge, Sentinel's Eyes, and Heliod's Punishment. which I think is like an interesting draft card, which seems to be making its way into these lists. Also running 2 copies of Karametra's Blessing. So I think that the general idea is that these decks really want to be drawing actually a billion cards. So, like, whereas the Orzhov version of the deck is drawing, like, just 1,000,000 cards off of Core Spirit Dancer and recurring with Luris, this deck is like, no, 1,000,000 cards isn't enough. We actually need 1,000,000,000. So that's kind of my read on why these decks seem to be preferring the blue. Because I think in a vacuum, like, I think I'd rather be on the Thoughtseize end of the spectrum than the Spell Pierce end of the spectrum if I'm playing a deck like this. So I have to imagine that these blue enchantments that are drawing you cards and maybe the ability to give your creatures flying are just what actually puts the Azorius version over the top of the Orzhov version. Do you have any thoughts just looking at this list and thinking about that?
It does become apparent the longer that you look at it that the white cards are what's really important.
Yeah.
And then when you think about your blue and black cards, they're definitely supporting cast. And when you think about, like we talked about last week, I think about how great Thoughtseize and Fatal Push are. Well, that's in a vacuum. Like if you don't know what your opponents are doing, you can usually say that Thoughtseize and Fatal Push are great. But maybe in a more targeted meta, not so much. Maybe what you really need to do is be evasive and close the game quickly instead of try to interact with one of their creatures or one of their cards in hand. A good example of this, I'd say, is probably Goblins, where how many times have we just seen Thoughtseize your Muxus, they just tutor up another one with Goblin Matron and play it anyway. Fatal Push your Skirk Prospector, fine, I'll play a Wily Goblin and I'll play a Goblin Chieftain, and then I'm still going to play Muxus on turn 4 anyway. So maybe those one-off pieces of interaction aren't as good as just getting them dead or building a battle cruiser that they can't be chump blocked. And that's I think that's where I'm going with the reasons that this is working without actually having played the matchups.
Yeah. Yep, it's a really good point. There's a few other things that I think bear discussion as well. Like, for example, this deck running 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke in the board, which I think can be an important spell against cards like Extinction Event, which the Orzhov list probably has no way of dealing with. So, yeah, you can run like your Spell Pierce and your Extinction Event against cards like that, and that gives you a fairly good way to lock up a game that your opponent might just have no other way of dealing with your stuff. If you have like your Karametra's Blessing or your Alcid of Life's Bounty out, and then you have like this counterspell backup, there might just literally be no way for your opponent to resolve an Ugin or to do anything that would ordinarily be really good at shutting you down. So I think that's really cool. And Thoughtseize, as good as it is, it can't protect you from the top of your opponent's deck. It also can't protect you from your opponent having 2 copies of whatever it is you're trying to remove. So I like it, and I do like the evasion as well. Like, I have frequently seen this deck run into problems where, maybe you assemble your massive battle cruiser creature, but if it doesn't have flying and your opponent has like a Krenko, say, they could just churn out a bunch of chump blockers, right? And if you're not having flying, then, maybe you're gaining life, maybe you're doing this stuff, but you're not really getting very far. You're not really necessarily closing the game. So I do like just being able to like slap some flying on your creature and just get it through,
I am concerned that blue-white, okay, we don't have a fast land, we don't have a pathway, and I'm looking at the mana base and we have 10 sources of blue mana total. Stuff like that just stands out as risky, but and in a long tournament can bite you, and black-white doesn't have those same problems, but just something to keep an eye on, kind of a downside.
No, you're totally right. I think the mana is absolutely the worst part of this deck, and you hit the nail on the head that recent cycles of mana have definitely hurt the allied color pairs and seem to be really favoring the enemy color pairs overall. Definitely a reason to consider running the other version of the deck. Now, let's talk about just some of what else that we're seeing here. So 4-color mid-range took down the tournament in the hands of Yuma Kozumi. This is your pretty typical Nissa, Krasis, Big Pig deck. So this isn't I think, going to be a surprise to anyone who's been following the historic meta. So basically, the overview of this deck is that, you run 4 Nissas, 3 Krasis, 4 Uros, 2 Yashans. You have the playset of Thoughtseizes. You have a bunch of growth spirals and some interaction in the form of, Fatal Push, Eliminate, and Ether Gust. And that's about it. You have another Yashan in the sideboard. You have some Gargaroths. You have some Narsets for your control matchups. You have Shock Typhoons for your control matchups. So this deck is, it's basically in its old form with the inclusion of Fatal Push. I'm trying to see if there's any other Kaladesh cards that work their way in, but I think not. So yeah, I mean, this deck's just still very well positioned. It has a massive top end. It's able to make up for playing a lot of these 1-for-1 cards by, just playing Krasis and Oro and Nissa, who just wins the game on her own. So yeah, and then of course Yashan. Now this is an interesting thing. There's been a lot of talking about how Yashan hasn't been showing up in Historic as much as it did in the past. So there was like this wave of Yashan decks, right? It was like all of a sudden Yashan was everywhere, shutting down all of these Jund and Rakdos decks. There's been like a move away from it.
The 4-color mid-range deck is originally Sultai, right? And it's the best Uro, Nissa, Krasis, and all the black interaction that you've come to hate. Growth Spiral, just a collection of banned cards from Standard and overpowered cards from Standard, plus Thoughtseize and now Fatal Push. But it had a terrible matchup, like just this Achilles heel that also happened to be among, if not the best deck in the format, and that was Jund Sacrifice. And the Jund Sacrifice deck, whether it's with Collected Company or with Trail of Crumbs, just kind of started taking over the format. It was one of the best matchups, one of the best decks to play against goblins, because Mayhem Devil and Cat Oven could just shred them and just tear all their goblins to pieces. So even if you had a good Muxus, they just Cat Oven, kill the hasty goblin, and then tear your board down little by little, or all at once. Heck, if they have like 2 devils. So anyway, in order to fix it, it came a little bit out of left field. Jund Sacrifice was the most played deck at the Mythic Invitation. What was the name of the tournament? The last historic tournament?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
Okay.
It was yeah.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a very big MPL level historic tournament.
Yeah.
Okay. And the most played deck was Jund Sacrifice, but the second most played deck was this Sultai deck that splashed for 1 card, the Yasharn, because Yasharn on its own just shut down the Sacrifice deck. And to hear people like LSV talk about that tournament, they said they just weren't prepared for that. They didn't bring a lot of removal for the pig. The thing is, it was a really good move that a lot of people didn't see coming. And then, ta-da, now that they know that it exists, you can play cards that deal with it. And Kaladesh did introduce a number of cards that help, which Thoughtseize can take the Yasharn out, and Chandra can take the Yasharn out. Plus you can run Maelstrom Pulse, Noxious Grasp, other various things. So Yasharn now is vulnerable. More people can kill it. So people tried going back to Sultai, and you saw a lot less Yasharn over the last few weeks. And what they learned is that Sultai, even with Fatal Push, has the problem. Still gets roasted by Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice. So now you see them trying to work Yasharn back in for the absolute haymaker, shut down your deck card, and it's a pretty easy splash, all things considered, because the mana is so good and you play so many lands in this deck. So the Yasharn is back in the deck, but I don't think it's the game breaker it was in the past, because now the Jund Sacrifice decks will be prepared. But I think it's important for Sultai to have something in that matchup, and this is the best thing they can have. That said, a lot of people seem to believe in Sultai. Like everywhere I look, I'm seeing it on Ladder and I'm hearing people talk about it. But I feel like it's vulnerable. I feel like its big technology play has been exposed. And I don't know if Fatal Push is the huge upgrade for this deck that it is for other archetypes, where it might be more effective. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to... It's called 4-color mid-range. I call it Sultai, even if it does splash the white card.
It's Sultai Splash Pig is really what this deck is.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where this deck lands, because it was the champion last time, right? Seth Manfield, I believe, won the whole thing with this.
Yep.
With this, so good. It's going to be interesting to see where the champ falls in this tournament.
Definitely, yeah. I don't think it's clear cut by any means, but I do expect plenty of people to be showing up with either Sultai or 4-color mid-range.
Oh, another thing about Sultai that's changed. The version that Seth and Brad Nelson ran in the last tournament had 4 Aethergust main.
Oh,
there
yes.
are more decks now, because that was the Goblin.
Right.
That was the Goblin
Goblin's
meta. Yep. There are more decks now that don't care about Aethergust.
Yes.
That is a blow, because we all know Nissa Breeding Pool Aethergust is a thing.
Yeah.
So,
you know, on the topic of Yashan, though, I think even if your opponent has answers to Yashan, I still think it's a fairly good include in this deck because, like, it gives you extra lands. You know, like, Yashan's a good combination with Growth Spiral. It's a good combination with Uro. It's a good combination with Hydroid Krasis. So, yeah, I would definitely be leaning 4-color as opposed to Sultai.
Do you want to hear something stupid, though?
Yeah, lay it on me.
It's totally off topic,
yeah.
But you said Yasharn, so I just recorded this video today. Did you know that if you have a Yasharn in play, players can't pay life to cast spells, right?
Yes.
So did you know if you have a Terror of the Peaks in play, they have to pay life to target it?
Oh, so they just can't target it?
It's Hex... Yeah, Terror of the Peaks just can't be targeted if you control a Yasharn.
That's amazing. Wow. All right, Naya, eat your heart out, man. That's what we're going with.
Coming soon to YouTube, anyway.
It does actually hose the Auras deck, surprisingly, because you can't sacrifice either the Doggo or the Alcid to do their thing, which is a pretty massive blow against the deck. So
wow, you can't sack the bodyguards. Wow,
yeah,
didn't even
exactly.
think of that.
So yeah, and those decks basically run no or very little removal. So once the Yashan comes down, it can just shut off like whole vectors of defense for that deck. So just a really good thing to know, like Yashan hoses a lot of stuff. It's not just these black-based decks. Like Yashan really does shut down a lot of different things. So let's move on here. You know, 2 copies in the top 8 with Rakdos Sacrifice. So let's take a look at what these decks are doing. And I think that the massive new tech that they got from Kaladesh here is the Scrap Heap Scrounger. And now this is something that everyone's talking about, and I think this list that I'm looking at it's really interesting to me. This is a very, very different slant on the deck than I think that we've seen in the past, even though it's playing a lot of familiar cards that won't surprise anybody. But I'm just really curious to hear what you think about this deck list, CGB, because to me this looks like an incredibly aggro version of this deck. So this is the number 2 Rakdos Sacrifice deck by Tristan Wild LaRue. And this is a Gigantha deck, which is interesting. Don't see many copies of that in Historic. Maybe it's on the rise. But we're running 4 Cauldron Familiars, 4 Priests of Forgotten Gods, 4 Woe Striders, 4 Stitches Supplier. So definitely leaning into that, like milling your Scroungers, milling your Cauldron Familiars, that kind of thing. 4 Midnight Reaper, which I also thought was interesting, a card that we have kind of been a little bit more on the fringes in some of these lists, I think, but this list is really leaning into it. And then, of course, 4 copies of Scrap Heap Scrounger. It's running 4 Witch's Oven, and the only other cards in the deck, apart from the creatures and the ovens, in the main anyway, are just 4 Claim the Firstborn. So we're not seeing any main deck removal, we're not seeing any Fatal Pushes, anything like that, any Thought Seizes. So I think this is really, really interesting, and it definitely seems to be like the new direction that Rakdos is going. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, CGB.
So you said about everything. When you said I'm curious to hear your thoughts the first time, I started collecting them, and you said everything.
Okay. All right.
I felt them just being taken out of my mouth. It's not very worried about interaction aside from claim. The Mayhem Devil, of course, and the Priest give you like these free removal spells built in, so you don't have to run Fatal Push. In fact, there's only 1 in the whole 75, 1 in the sideboard.
Yeah.
This list looks like in an open field where nobody is targeting it, it's probably very hard to stop and can put up a ton of damage. But it's got nothing on the pig. Like if Yasharn comes down, this deck is like done in this incarnation. They need the 3 Noxious Grasp out of the sideboard or the 1 Fatal Push. That's all they've got. You know, no Chandra's here. It's very limited in that regard, that it's just ignoring the pig. So it gives you an idea of where the meta has come and gone, and people were on that card, then off it, and now it's probably coming back because this deck appears to be really good. Because, man, I do not want to play against Mayhem Devil with so many of the decks in the format right now. Goblins, mono red aggro, 4-color mid-range, aside from drawing Yasharn, it just looks terrible. Auras. Like, you just tear... Auras versus Priest of Forgotten Gods is a joke.
Yeah.
So Scrap Heap Scrounger, I think that's a big upgrade over Dreadhorde Butcher.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Butcher is the card that's missing from this list, right? Because I think if you're going aggro, that's typically a card that people have leaned on. So what you're saying is just that you couldn't make room for it once you included the Scrounger, and the Scrounger is just a better include. Is that kind of the conclusion?
Oh, yeah. It's so much easier to cast with any creature in your graveyard, and there's 4 Stitcher suppliers. You just get it back. It gives you something to do with your priest mana. You can sacrifice it and get it back the same turn. You can claim it and just get in for 3 more damage, which I'm sure happens from time to time. Just always having something to sacrifice is pretty amazing for this deck, quite honestly. The cat was already pretty awesome. This is almost cat 2.0 as far as always having something to feed the machine.
Yeah.
Oh, Phyrexian Tower. Phyrexian Tower Scrap Heap Scrounger, you just can't kill it. If you try to exile it, they just throw it into the tower. They can bring it back the same phase if they have another creature in the graveyard. That's insane.
Yeah, and people have pointed out that, some of the nice little synergies with the Scrounger are, like, for example, sometimes you struggle to find things to do with your priest mana. And having a Scrounger in the yard is a perfect thing to pump that priest mana into. So you can do, you can have these cool sequences with the deck where you play a Stitches Supplier, you sack it to your tower, you play something else, you sack the stuff to the priest, then, you exile that supplier from the graveyard or whatever it milled to get your Scrounger back. So you can just have these massive mana turns kind of out of nowhere. You can go off on turns like 3 or 4 doing stuff like that and just really get a lot done.
So much of this deck was legal and standard.
Yeah, I know. It's really something.
Oh my goodness. Historic. I want to know what you do with the Sky Sovereign console flagship in the sideboard. Is that for Nissa?
Could be Nissa. Maybe it flies over Yasharn. That was an interesting include to me as well. It could also be that maybe it dodges some typical removal or dodges sweepers, something like that. But that does stand out to me as well. It's really cool.
Oh my gosh. So there are 16 3-power creatures to crew that sucker. That is amazing.
Yeah. It's cool. I would love it if we got to see some Sky Sovereigns hit the battlefield in this tournament. It was always so exciting to see this card in play in Standard. So, yeah. I mean, proving that it can hold its place in the sky in Historic. All right, so let's move along here. There's a lot of decks that are showing up, which I don't think we need to go that deep on. They're just existing decks. Mono Red Goblins is still here. We'll just take a quick look at this 4th place list by 42 Sporks. This list, it basically just looks like a stock list. It's the Iron Crag Feet version of the deck. It is running 3 Chandra Torch of Defiance in the sideboard, so that's, the pickup.
And that card is pretty amazing for what it does, both ramping to Muxus and killing off Yasharns that might stop you from using Skirk Prospectors and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's a very, very good pickup for the deck. But I think my takeaway is that, Goblins plus Chandra is just basically still a deck.
What is Herald's Horn?
Yeah, I know. That's an interesting one, isn't it?
The first time I saw this card, I was watching one of the Japanese MPL players whose name is escaping me tragically because it makes me sound bad. But honestly, green hair and really funny guy. Really, really funny, but everything was in Japanese. So I can only go by the emotes. How funny it was. But I saw this card, and it's kind of crazy. It's a 3-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Goblins. And creature spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less. Okay, nice. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand.
Mm-hmm. So this must be in for control matchups, right? That's what I'm imagining.
That's a card advantage machine is what that is.
Yeah. I feel like if you're in a matchup where you expect your opponent to be answering a bunch of your stuff, then I feel like Herald's Horn is a perfect way to be like, all right, Ether Gust this, sucker.
Yeah, I'll just draw another 2 goblins a turn. If this was in one of the decks in the last tournament, I don't remember it. So this one slipped under the radar for me.
I think this is some new tech in the deck. And I can't comment as to, I don't really have an opinion as to whether this is what we want to be doing, but, it seemed to be good enough to get this player into 4th place. So definitely some tech to keep an eye on for the deck. But I think that's what we're looking at here with these Goblins decks is that, like 90% of the cards are kind of locked in. And then it's just kind of personal choice whether, like, for example, this deck list is running 1 Chain Whirler in the main. It's running a Crater Maker, which is interesting. But,
main deck hate for Grafdigger's Cage.
Yeah. Which is, that's something, right? But
welcome to a historic.
A number of people are maining Grafdigger's Cage, so it's not really surprising when you think about it. But so Goblins is just a question of what you particularly prefer. But, it's basically the same deck that we know and love. So I'm also seeing Mono Black Gift here, which placed 2 places higher than Azorius Gift in this tournament. So let's just quickly compare these 2 lists. This Mono Black list, just kind of reading down, it looks pretty stock from the last version of the deck. Picked up some fatal pushes from Kaladesh, but otherwise it seems kind of about what we remember for this deck. I don't think we need to really go into detail on that. I'm a little bit more interested in this Azorius Gift deck. This might be the real original list in this top 8 to come out of Kaladesh. And by original, I mean it's just playing a lot of Kaladesh cards. So this is a Minister of Inquiries deck, which is pretty cool, man. I'm pretty stoked to see the Minister.
You're into the Minister.
Back in a constructed format, This card's just sweet. It's 1 blue for a 1/2. When it ETBs, it gives you 2 energy, and you can pay an energy for target player to mill 3 cards. So you can start milling yourself as quickly as turn 2. This is a Skyclave Apparition deck, so that's something interesting to note. Skyclave Apparition gets better when you can get it back from the graveyard as a hasty 4/4 to get a second bite at the apple, so that's pretty cool. It's an Angel of Invention deck, so this card, of course, excellent with GPG. And also a Hallowblade deck, which... Tell me about the Hallowblade. Why are we excited to play Hallowblade in this deck?
Seasoned Hallowblade does allow you to get on the front foot, but it can also block, which is something that people forget compared to Adanto Vanguard. If you threaten to block something up to 3 toughness, discard a card to make it indestructible. The Hallowblade's not bad, and the fact that it can go either way is different compared to something like Scrapheap Scrounger, Skyclave Shade. But in this deck,
it's a discard enabler, right? That's what I'm thinking.
Yes, that's what it really is.
It's a no-mana discard outlet.
We've all been there, man. We've all been there with this deck. You keep a perfectly serviceable hand, and off the top of your deck, you draw like 3 God Pharaoh's Gifts and no Chart of Courses to discard them.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, this deck is an all-in combo thing. Like, if you look, it's kind of rare these days to see something with no pivot, but it really doesn't. The deck is either going to have a God Pharaoh's Gift and reanimate some creatures and beat you to death with them, or it's going to do nothing. In the sideboard, the closest thing to the pivot is the 1 copy of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. So yeah, this is all in, and sometimes your God Pharaoh's Gifts are in the bottom 20 cards of your library, and you look like a really ugly mid-range deck.
Yep. Yes, indeed. Now I'm looking at the sideboard of this deck. I'm seeing 3 Authority of the Consoles. That has to be for the Neostorm deck, right?
That deck, where is it?
Yeah, I know.
It's like nobody can even find it.
It's not showing up, right? Were there any copies of it at all in this top 25? I'm not seeing them. 21, I think, was the highest placement of that deck, yeah.
Right next to Mardu Vehicles and Teamer Reclamation.
Yeah, right? Which gives you an idea.
The thing about Authority, it's actually insanely good against goblins.
It shuts off the Mux's turn?
Yep, the Mux's turn is really ugly compared to what they're used to. and then you get another turn to
I
interact.
suppose the life gain could be kind of key as well, right? If your opponent's making 1,000,000,000 1/1s and you're just gaining a life for each one of them, could be kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, until they attack you, until they all become 3/3s.
Like,
yeah.
Well, that's why I'm, because they also run 4 Cage in the sideboards
And 3 Wrath of God. Yeah.
So, like, are you
really
bringing in like 7? You know what I mean? Like 3 Authority and 4 Cage against these goblin stacks. That seems kind of extreme to me.
Well, you got to do something.
Yeah, I suppose so.
The seasoned Hollowblade isn't looking particularly sharp in that matchup, and I don't know how much time you have for Search for his contest, so there's 5 cards I think I could easily cut.
Yeah. Maybe that's just it. Maybe it's also that you have these cards in your main deck that are just laughable against goblins, and you just need to freaking get them out of there, right? So yeah, that's a really exciting deck. I would love it if this deck showed up in the championship. I feel like there's a lower likelihood of that happening because I just feel like pro players tend to avoid decks such as this.
I don't know. I would be surprised if there weren't some amount of Godfarrow's gift strategies, just because it's something that not as many people are preparing for. You talked about preparing for the meta. From reading Twitter and listening to podcasts, I think that people are gearing up for a fight between Rakdos Sacrifice, Goblins, and Yasharn.
Yeah.
And Auras and Godfarrow's Gift are 2 decks that I think just decide we're going to play a different kind of game.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if people went that route.
Yeah, it's true. It's like a nice sidestep in the meta. Okay, last major archetype I wanted to cover before we kind of wrap this up is the Gandalf, right? So we had a Gandalf make their way into the top 8, Azorius Control by Lucas Hane. Now, I know that Croquis has been playing Azorius in Historic lately and seems to be kind of excited about it.
I wouldn't call him excited about
really?
it. He said he's quit Magic forever after he won a match with it because he thought it was so obnoxious and terrible.
So maybe
he was disappointed in himself.
Maybe I caught him at the wrong moment or something. Yeah, I have not been super excited about these like straight up control decks in Historic. They just seem a bit too slow, a little bit too dirtily, and frankly, Teferi Hero of Dominaria is just not quite the top end it used to be. One thing I do remember Croquis saying is he resolved a Teferi and his opponent resolved a Nissa, and he was looking at the table and being like, one of these Planeswalkers isn't like the other. He's pretty down on the Teferi Nissa matchup in the head-to-head. Do you want to just give us any analysis as a seasoned Gandalf on this deck and how you think it's favored or disfavored in the meta?
I love blue-white control decks, and I've said this before about historic blue-white control, and I'll say it again. I would probably, if I were playing a tournament like this, I would try to make it work because it's in my nature to do so. But this is not a format I want to try to control. It's out of control. You have to have a matchup that not only you believe in, but feels really good. And then on top of that, you have to deal with all the other things in the format. I just don't see it. And I think that there's a lot to worry about. Playing counter spells, for example. I'm playing against Rakdos. Am I going to censor their turn to Scrap Heap Scrounger? I guess, but then the next turn they play a Stitcher Supplier and bring it back on my end step for free, dodging my Wrath of God, and I don't see it against the Nissa deck. You're just constantly dealing with Uro and Hydroid Krasis, and how do you deal with those things? This deck plays Shark Typhoon, and that's your win con. It doesn't seem like tapping 6 mana for a Shark Typhoon or cycling one is any good against a deck like Goblins. You can go down the list and you can look at every card in the deck and you can say, yeah, but it's so weak in matchup XYZ. And it's so bad in this spot. And it's so bad in this spot. And of course, that's what sideboarding is. You can tech your deck out for game 2, but I'd be surprised if there's a game 1 where we're actually favored. It's like we have to have the right cards in every spot at every time. And I don't believe it.
Well, and it's interesting. You look at cards like Cast Out, they're playing 4 of in the main, Baffling End, they're playing 3 of in the main. You're thinking, well, surely that must be in there to answer Uro or, to answer Nissa or whatever. And it's like, yes, those are the kind of cards that you're answering with these spells. But if you think about it, you're just like, you're down a card, right? It's like they got a 3/3 out of the equation, and your cast out just took out that Nissa. You know, if you baffling end your opponent's Oro, they got a card out of it. So it's really not a sustainable way to tackle these other, you know, these harder to deal with opposing permanents.
Yeah, full agree. I would try to make it work, but man, we're missing Teferi. You know what I mean? The 3 mana Teferi.
Tef 3. It would be interesting to see if Tef 3 would still be considered too powerful in this format, you know, in light of all the other things that are happening. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That card is messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess still one of the reasons why Azorius is played in Pioneer, right? Because it's still legal there. All right, CGB. Well, in conclusion on the historic format, I think that you summed it up pretty well. I think that these sacrifice lists definitely seem to be kind of at the top of the heap. And so how you approach the format seems to be like, yeah, maybe you're playing Sultai and you feel like you have some good answers to that. Or maybe you're playing one of these Auras decks and you're just trying to like be faster than them or gain enough life or just kind of go over the top of them quickly enough that it doesn't matter. But that's what I would think about like going into this tournament is, do I want to play a sack deck? And if I don't want to play a sack deck, like what do I feel like lines up the best against them? So I kind of agree with your assessment. It seems like goblins, sacrifice lists, Sultai / 4-color lists are definitely like kind of my top 3 in the meta. And then the other lists are just kind of, you know, trying to sidestep or just like try to gain a slight edge from people not being as prepared for your list.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with that.
Cool. Also, Gruul. Notable lack of Gruul. So we don't need to talk more about that, but I just think it's interesting that the reintroduction of Burning Tree Emissary has not been sufficient to bring Gruul back up into the historic metagame. Anyway, in these tournaments, I'm sure it's all over the place on the ladder. All right, moving to Standard, CGB. So, yeah, I'm excited to dive into Standard a little bit and get your takes on what's happening there.
All right, so the first one up is Gruul Adventures, and it feels like the last time we checked in on Standard, at least the last time I remember, like really getting hyped to watch a tournament, Gruul Adventures just seemed like it was going to be the runaway deck of the format. It had become between 25 and 40% of most tournaments. Again and again, we saw these numbers for Gruul Adventures that started to imply that nothing could compete with it, especially once they figured out the sideboard plan of a bunch of Oxes, a bunch of Vivians, the Akroan War, right? This go big, best mid-range deck in the format sideboard plan that many decks couldn't beat. But this is why this format, since the Omnath ban, is so great, because so many decks figured it out and adjusted, and they began to prey on Gruul Adventures. And Gruul Adventures, actually, the last time I did a Meta Monday show, I didn't do one this week. Yeah, I had to record something. So the week before that, we looked at a tournament and where Gruul Adventures was one of those decks that was represented like 30% of the field, had a 39% win rate.
Yikes.
I mean, that's not best deck in the format behavior, right? No. That shows that people could fix it. And then you look at the decks that were on top of that tournament, and it's big red Ironcrag Fee Ugin, Teamer Ramp, mono green Food. You know, these decks that I think a lot of people wrote off several weeks before that came all the way back around. So where Gruul is at now is it has all these decks that keep presenting things that has trouble killing. The Teamer deck, it has to kill all these Terror of the Peaks, and it has to worry about Genesis Ultimatum if it gets into those long mid-range games post-board. Mono Green Food, just Wicked Wolf and Troll King, just smacking their creatures around. And Dimir Control has really risen up, just being this deck that has run so many removal spells. And the biggest thing I found as a control mage dealing with Gruul Adventures is if they never untap with a Lovestruck Beast, Bone Crusher Giant, or Mammoth, a creature that lets them play the Henge or play Embercleave and hit you really hard, if they can never untap with one of those, they have a really hard time getting traction in the game. So they're actually vulnerable to just a kill-it-all Scorched Earth, destroy every 3-mana creature that moves attack. And that's what several decks have figured out. Doom Foretold did that for a few weeks too, before people figured out how to pick on Doom Foretold.
So let me ask you on one angle there. I feel like the secret weapon against decks like Dimir Control in the past for these adventure lists has been the Innkeeper. Is that have they figured out a way to kind of get around that?
Just more removal, dude.
just kill
more,
it all.
more. Just kill it all. No, we were looking at Dimir Control lists running 4 Bloodchief's Thirst, several Heartless Acts and Eliminates, Murderous Rider,
wow,
Essence Scatter, 4 Extinction Events, and 2 Shadows Verdicts.
Wow.
Kill it
Shadows
all.
Verdict making its appearance in Standard.
Yeah, really good against Rogues, taking out their graveyard. Really good against Kroxa, if anybody dares bring that deck to a tournament anymore.
And remind me, does Shadows Verdict even hit Klothys?
It only if it's turned on
alive?
or in the graveyard. Yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So the approach on Klothys, I think that the best find there is you're seeing more Essence Scatters all over the place.
Just don't let it come down.
Yeah, counter it on the stack. Yep.
Yeah, got it. Okay, yeah, awesome. Gruul Adventures, people seem to be targeting it pretty well. Does it have answers to that, or is it kind of folding? Like, is Gruul Adventures just saying, okay, you got me, I can't really handle all of this hate?
It's an intrinsically super powerful deck. It does have answers, but it's what it needs now is if there are decks built around Ugin and Genesis Ultimatum and Wicked Wolf and killing every single thing that moves. Gruul Adventures needs something to start beating up on those decks and punishing them for the way that they are built. Because those aren't fast decks and they have tons, and in the case of like the control decks, there's tons of spot removal, which was something, remember, not that long ago, we couldn't do that in Standard because cards like Uro and Omnath just laughed at spot removal because they got ahead every time they played something. So something needs to punish decks with a lot of spot removal. Historically speaking, that's control decks, but then, the ramp deck, I think, is in a good position to do that. But basically, these decks need to start cannibalizing each other so that they have to start trimming the removal spells and trimming the cards that make Gruul miserable. And then Gruul can come out swinging the Embercleave again and catch them unaware. So it's a rotation that needs to happen. I think where we're at right now, it's really close to where Gruul is just a deck you can play in this tournament because people have to respect other decks again, which they didn't have to do 2 or 3 weeks ago. But now that we know what those other decks are, people are starting to work it out. Food, Temur Ramp, Dimir Control, to me, are the big ones. And, another lurker, which is Dimir Rogues.
Yeah, I mean, like, because here's the thing. You can't build a main deck. It's hard for me to imagine building a main deck that is excellent against Gruul and against Rogues at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So
Esper Doom did that. And then the other decks took off and Esper Doom became bad.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
Like there was 1 week where Esper Doom was arguably the best choice because it did exactly that, what pick on Rogues and Adventures for 1 week.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So it does seem like little rock paper scissors ing coming into the Standard format here, which I think is a good thing. It forces you to really respect the field. Do we want to move on to the next deck, or did you have more to say about Gruul Adventures?
I think Gruul Adventures is a really good choice, and I think it's going to turn out to be somewhere between 15 to 20% of the meta, because I think that a lot of people will come to the conclusion that the rest of the top level decks need to be respected, and that leaves room for Gruul to do its thing.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Rogues. Rogues is such an interesting deck in this format because if you ask a casual Magic player, they'll say that Rogues is broken and needs to be banned and things like that. It's like the most annoying deck. I did a fun experiment where I played a Rogues deck and I asked people for 1,000 dislikes on the video. I got 5,000 dislikes on that video. I've never even had 500 dislikes before.
Wow.
So people hate this deck, but honestly, it's the new Teamer Adventures. It came out like really hot and seemed to have all the strong cards, but then as the format goes on, people learn more and more about how to play against it and what works against it. And its card pool is a little more limited. Blue and black don't have access to removal or adjustments to absolutely everything. And the world around it becomes more powerful and more refined as people figure out how to build their decks and sideboards. And Rogues is still a very good strategy, and the slower the format gets, the more you see Teamer Ramp and Dimir Control, the more it seems like you'd want to play Rogues. Mono green food too, but all of these decks have ways to make Rogues squirm. You know, Ox of Agonis and the Great Henge are two cards that have been found that just make Rogues squirm. And Feasting Troll King, there's the Great Henge in the food deck as well, are big pains in the neck. Remember Chainweb Arachnir? Nobody needs that anymore because nobody needs Chainweb Arachnir anymore because they found much better ways to make Rogues miserable. And I'm interested in playing Dimir Rogues against Dimir Control. That's one of those chess matches where the control deck has a bunch of removal, but Rogues also has card advantage and disruption. It seems like if Dimir Control becomes popular, because a control deck should be pretty solid against the green mid-range deck and the green ramp deck, which are mono green food and Teamer Ramp, it seems like that means Dimir Control should be good. If Dimir Control is good, is Rogues good against Dimir Control? And can it come back and turn things around? And then you have the dance of, well, when Rogues had to worry about Gruul Adventures, they played a bunch of Low Mages dominations and just said, I'm stealing your things. That's not going to work on Dimir Control. Their plan is to resolve a Shark Typhoon against you. I don't know.
You just can't deal with that, right?
Yeah. I really want to know how that matchup breaks down and what either side can do. They're the same colors with different strategies. So you have mystical disputes, maybe some hand hate weaving their way through either deck list. It's really interesting, I think. I want to see that matchup, but I think Rogues might be trending. It had trended way down. Rogues was like the bottom of the barrel for probably a week and a half. I think it might trend up for this event. I think we might see 8 to 10% of the meta play Rogues. Another thing to kind of throw a wrench into this is we didn't talk about which Rogues deck, right? So
that's
Lurrus
true.
Rogues,
There's so many of them. Yeah.
The Lurrus Rogue deck was the most popular for a while, but when Gruul Adventures was the deck, then what you did is you took Lurrus out of the equation and you ran Zareth San so that you could just steal a Lovestruck Beast or a Great Henge and use it against them. And that version has been popular for about 2 weeks. You've seen a lot more Brazen Borrowers and Zareth Sans than Lurrus. And I don't know what the right call is right this second. It seems like Zareth is still going to be very important against Gruul, which might trend up. But Zareth doesn't seem very good against Dimir, where it's just Heartless Act bait. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm curious to see what happens with that, because I'm not even sure which version of Rogues is the right call for the weekend. If Gruul Adventures is going to trend up, you probably want the Zareth version. And the Zareth version is also very good against the Achilles heel Troll King, if you just take their Troll King before they get a chance to bring it into the battlefield, by timing your mill triggers carefully. That's pretty good. That'll work.
It's awesome. I love that Rogues is in the metagame, and I love that it still has such a diversity of options in building it. It can really dance. It can juke, it can jive. It's a fun deck to play and an absolutely miserable deck to play against in every sense. I don't foresee Esper Doomfortold coming back. I think the deck is a bit too narrow. It always was this really fun, really solid tap-out engine deck. It's still good in best of one, and it's good against certain things, but man,
You do not want to play it against Genesis Ultimatum. You don't want to play it against Feasting Troll King and the Great Henge. You don't want to play it against Ugin. And so the evolution of Dimir Control has been to play a lot of Ashioks and Ugins, not just Shark Typhoon, which is a pretty strong arm way to go about this meta when you're talking about 5-mana Planeswalkers and 8-mana Planeswalkers.
Yeah.
I think Mono Green Food, Temur Ramp, and Dimir Control are going to be 3 decks that show up in pretty solid numbers, and I have no idea what those will be. It could be, I think each of those is due to about 5 to 10% of the meta, and I have no idea what it should be, to be honest.
Let's talk about Mono Green Food a little, because I've heard rumblings that this deck is actually like a tier 1 deck or one of the best decks in the format, which kind of surprised me. It did well in at least one tournament recently where, bunch of decks kind of in the top 8, and it seems to kind of surge up, but it's just such an unknown to me. It's one of the decks I have a hard time. On the last podcast, I was kind of dissing it and saying that I had a hard time imagining it could really be a really strong contender moving forward in the format. What do you think? Do you think that this deck is a tier 1 deck at the moment?
It's a meta deck, but it's one of the better meta decks in a long time because it has a very solid matchup with Gruul, a very solid matchup with Esper, and it is a headache for the decks that I think you could look at the Dimir Rogues matchup going different ways depending on the builds. I've heard Rogues players say that they're ahead. I've always felt behind against Food when I play Rogues, personally. I've seen too many Troll Kings, but I always play the Lurrus version. So that matchup is close. I'm not sure about the ramp deck. It seems like Brazen Borrower and Terror of the Peak should be really good against the Food deck.
I would imagine that the Food deck is just a little bit too slow and a little bit too small ball to keep up with the Temur ramp deck. That would be my estimation.
I've been amazed, though. I in my rampage playing Mono Green Food on Thanksgiving and recording the video the day before Thanksgiving, I played against a lot of Ugin decks. A lot of them.
Okay.
And I was amazed that I could beat them. Witch's Oven and the Great Henge. You just keep bringing the king back again and again. If you can achieve Witch's Oven, Troll King, and Great Henge, it feels like they're just under pressure. And this game may take another 10 turns because they're using Maze Mind Tome and they're drawing cards and they're playing an Extinction Event to hold you off another turn while plussing their Ugin, and then they get their Ugin to 9, but they have to minus it because you built a board again, and you just keep replaying the frickin' Troll Kings and more threats every turn. It might take 10 turns, but you're just waiting. You're just waiting for the one turn where they draw 3 lands in a row and their Ugin has too little loyalty to deal with the whole board, and then it's just over. You just smash them to pieces.
Well, and one of the things I do like about the Food deck is if you're trying to kill the Food deck via damage, it's kind of a laughable thing to do, right? They're like, great, you did me 10 with your little Terror of the Peaks combo. I have 7 Food in play, and a Great Henge, cute damage, bro.
Oh yeah, it can be laughable if you get going, 100%.
I feel like you really do need to win the board to beat these mono Food decks. I feel like it's pretty unlikely that you're gonna just kind of get them out of nowhere, right? Just put a bunch of damage on the table and swing the game in one big turn. I feel like you have to get pretty lucky, or you have to really outplay your Food opponent to do that.
I agree with that. Yeah, so is the deck tier 1 is what you led with. If Gruul is still very, very popular, I think so. If Gruul actually takes a vacation at the tournament, then Food is still a good deck, but there is a serious lack of agency in it if your Wicked Wolf isn't actively dominating. You know what I mean? Because you don't have much removal or ways to deal with the opponent's things. And if they, for example, kill your Henge and they're not afraid of your Wicked Wolf and they hit an Extinction Event and they're prepared for Witch's Oven, sometimes it does feel like you're just not doing anything with the Food deck and you can't really deal with your opponent's creatures or their board. So I It's interesting. I'm really curious to see how many people play this deck and where it falls. I think of Willie Adel, Brazilian Hall of Famer pro who just always likes these like green creature decks. I bet he loves this deck.
When I look at this mono green deck, it like its place in the meta actually kind of reminds me of the mono green aggro deck in the pre-rotation format, where to me it seems like strong and good and top 8able, but I have a hard time imagining it like really consistently taking down tournaments. So
you're coming around is what you're saying. Soon we'll be doing the food deep dive.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that I was always a champion of the mono green aggro deck because I thought it was an underdog deck that could top 8, right? I was never the person waving the flag of like, this deck can actually win the biggest tournaments. I just really liked the fact that I felt like it was skirting tier 1 on its really good days. And I also liked the fact of that you could really make deep cuts into high mythic with a deck like that. And I kind of feel like the power level of this mono green food deck seems similar. Like, it seems like it's a respectable deck. You're not going to get laughed out of the room. And it can place very, very high and make deep runs into tournaments. But it would just surprise me if this was, like, actually a number 1 deck at any point in the format.
I think I would agree with that. I would also say, between mono green food, Gruul Adventures, and the Temur Ramp deck that we'll probably have time for a few words for, we're talking about, like, 3 of the top 5 or 6 decks that have this core of Lovestruck Beast, Kazandu Mammoth, and 3-ish copies of the Great Henge. Like, they all threaten to just take over the game with the Great Henge. So, whoever is playing this tournament, you got to answer the Henge. I mean, somebody who can reliably just keep a Henge from happening, like, Henge is a big commitment to have in your deck. If you can't get it online easily, it can make your draws very clunky if the opponent has good ways to stop it. So it's kind of interesting to see 3 different strategies that use the Henge both as a way to straight up win the game if left unanswered, but also as a sort of decoy to the other thing that they're going to do. You have to deal with the Henge, but even if you do, you might get Embercleaved out of Gruul Adventures, you might get Troll Kinged a few times out of the mono green food, and you'll probably get Genesis Ultimatum Terror of the Peaked out of Temur Ramp.
Yeah, you can see these spots where, let's say you're playing a card like Elspeth Conquers Death, right? And you're like, okay, do I hit the Henge or do I hit the Troll King?
Oh my god, yeah. Oh, it's the worst. I spend my life doing this.
Neither of those options feels great when you have to deal with both of them, so...
Yeah, that's why Yorion is, like, the only solution is to have the Yorion in your hand after you play the Elspeth Conquers Death. But speaking of Yorion, once the Lord and Sky Noodle savior of the format, I don't think it's even anywhere near the top right now, because even what I just talked about, Yorion and Elspeth Conquers Death, I think it's just too slow.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just take an epic beating from all those creatures while dealing with the Henge. It's so awkward.
Well, and you've just got things like Omen of the Sun is laughable against a trample creature, right? It's laughable against flyers. It just seems like it's laughable against Embercleave. So it just seems like a lot of the actual real problems that you want to be blocking with your dorky little tokens, they're just not doing anything for you. And so, yeah, if you're not just maintaining like a iron grasp over the game, if you're not just keeping up every step of the way, you could easily just fall behind with these Yorion lists.
Mm-hmm. Full agree. Also, the other thing I learned playing mono green food for a few days, green has all the good card draw, man.
Oh yeah.
They got this artifact that just sits on the battlefield and draws you a card for free every time you play a creature and makes mana. They've got this 1 mana creature that just draws a card for every good creature you play. They've got this Genesis Ultimatum that draws 5 cards and casts some of them for free. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, what happened?
What are we doing trying to draw cards with blue? My Yorion deck just runs out of gas, I've got like 2 cards in my hand. They've got 7, and they have a full board. Nice Shatter the Sky, control player. Good work.
Yeah, especially since it's like you look at these decks, they invest 3 mana to play a creature, and then the next turn they invest 4 mana to play their henge, and then for the entire rest of the game they are just popping off, right? Whereas in these Yorion decks, like, you have to invest a whole heckload of mana into casting all of these card draw spells, and then you have to resolve your 5 mana Yorion on a turn where you can actually afford to essentially take a turn off, right, to kind of reap the benefits of all of your Omen of the Seas and your Treacherous Blessings. And sometimes there's just not a good window to do that, especially if you have to pay 3 mana to get the dang Yorion into your hand in the first place. So I do feel like if you just look at the kind of mana to card advantage ratio, it doesn't start to get into your favor in the Yorion deck until the extreme late game. Whereas, you know, a lot of these green decks, like, they're just popping off, drawing a billion cards, like, as soon as turn 4 or 5. So, yeah, it's kind of wild.
Yeah, green, probably still best color, despite lack of Oko, Omnath, and Uro. Probably still the card advantage color of choice.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so I'm curious to go a little bit more in-depth on this Dimir control thing, because out of all of these lists that we're looking at, this is kind of the archetype I feel like the least familiar with, or like the least equipped to really talk intelligently about. So can you just briefly kind of take me through the important cards in these Dimir control lists and, like, you know, just your thoughts on how the deck's positioned in the meta?
Sure. There's been a few different builds going around, and the one you have here has 4 Shark Typhoons in the main with 2 Ashiok and 2 Ugins. I've seen a lot of builds with all the Shark Typhoons in the board and Ashioks and Ugins in the main, just depending what kind of meta you want to mess with. If you're expecting to get attacked a lot, if Gruul is the thing, Shark Typhoon is very slow and clumsy against them, whereas the Planeswalkers have immediate impact. So I think that's what we're looking at here. With Shark Typhoon coming back into the main deck, we're saying that we don't expect as much Gruul. We want to torture the Rogues decks, and we also want to never tap out when our opponent might cast a Genesis Ultimatum, something like that. So those are some of the key things to notice first. My favorite thing about these decks, quite honestly, is that it's a Maze Mind Tome deck.
I was going to say,
I love that card.
I just feel like you couldn't even ever play a deck like this in Standard right now without Maze Mind Tome, right?
You need the card advantage,
yeah,
and you'd need the draw smoothing, because these control decks need the right cards in the right place at the right time. The Brain Book makes it happen, is really what it's all about.
Yeah, and that little life bump, gaining 4
Yes.
or 8 or even 12 life in a game, can really keep you hanging on, right?
100%.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm looking at this list and I see the power, but I feel like this feels like such a 51% win rate kind of a deck to me. Like, it's hard for me to imagine a deck like this, like, being really consistently strong without being piloted by, like, an absolute master. But maybe I'm just, I just haven't played games with the deck and I'm kind of missing some of the finer points of how powerful it is. But, like, do you think that this deck has what it takes to be, like, a consistently high percentage deck?
Yeah, but you have to have a good read on your meta. This is a season to taste 75, because we're looking at Brandon Peterson's list from an SCG Tour satellite, and you're seeing cards that a week ago you didn't see in the main. We talked about the Shark Typhoon thing already, but remember when I said there were 4 Extinction events and 2 Shadows verdicts? Here there's 3 Extinction events, but if you look at that sideboard, it still has 1 more Extinction event and 2 Shadows verdicts. This list isn't expecting as much Gruul, is expecting a lot of sort of other decks, but is ready to shift back into full kill-em-all strategy where necessary. So it's about the read you get on the meta, I think, 100%. It's going to pay you back in your win rate with this deck. The Brazen Borrowers in the main, that is a nod to other people having Shark Typhoons. It's sort of teched for the Mirror, I think. Like, the Mirror and Temur ramp. When I look at 3 negates and 3 neutralize, like, you really don't want those if Gruul is everywhere, I don't think.
Yeah. 3 main deck negate can really bite you in some matchups.
The other part that I'm looking at and just want to remind people about, Crawling Barrens is a legitimate win con.
Yes.
There's actually decks that can't deal with that at all.
I'm so glad to see this card showing up in constructed formats, because I remembered seeing it in the spoiler and just thinking, like, that card's going places, man. And
so I remember you... Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, this seems like maybe one of the better decks to put it in, too, because this is definitely a leave-up mana kind of a deck for a lot of the game, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sort of. That's...
Sort of.
You're leading me right where I want to go.
Great.
Because you talked about it's a leave-up mana kind of deck, but you also said, does it have the power? I'm going to send you a deck that won the standard challenge on MTGO in Discord. I want you to open it and tell me what you see. It's also Dimir and could be categorized as control. And I think it's going to blow your mind to see the extremes that you can take this deck in.
Okay. Ooh, I'm excited.
Yeah, just scroll down to the very first deck. It's the first place build.
All right, so I'm seeing, some of my pet cards in this deck, right? It's running 2 Ashiok, 4 Ugins. The full 4, it's running 3 Atris, 4 Solemn Simulacrums, 4 Extinction Event, which is a pretty big deal. So this is definitely more of a tap-out deck going on here.
Yeah, Elspeth's Nightmare, Omen of the Sea, 4 Maze Mind Tome. It also still has 4 Neutralize, 4 Jwari Disruption, 2 Negate, and 2 Essence Scatter. How does it fit it all in, Arjuna? I'll tell you. It's a Yorion deck!
Oh, it's a Yorion deck? I missed that. That's
it's
amazing.
It's a Yorion deck, too. I mean, it's a ramp Planeswalker counterspell deck. When you see it in this form, do you see what I mean? It has 4 Crawling Barrens. Yeah. Do you see what I mean about the power? Like, you can ratchet up the power.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I'm so happy to see Solemn Simulacrum getting some play in Standard, because it's just such a sweet card, and with Yorion, I love it. Love it.
I would be shocked if this style of build was played in the tournament, because pro players, MPL members, and Rivals members, they love a lot more, I guess you would say, agency. They love cards like Shark Typhoon. They love more of a draw-go style. They don't like tapping 4 mana for a sorcery speed card like a Solemn Simulacrum nearly as much as they might have several years ago. But I just wanted to show you the extremes you might see in Dimir.
Yeah, it's pretty epic. And any deck that runs Atris is definitely going to get my attention going there.
Dude, Atris into Yorion, dude.
Hey, man.
Go for the ride.
Let's go. So, okay, so let me ask you, I feel like we're kind of moving towards wrapping up here. What would you be sleeving up for this tournament if you were playing in it?
Ooh, well, If my mission was to do my very best...
Yeah, if you had to set aside,
I'm going for the money,
the CGB ethos, and just like be the player that you would need to be to have the best chance to win the tournament, what would you be sleeving up?
I do think that Gruul is going to be back on the rise, so it's about how I want to kill it.
Okay.
So, for me, it's not about playing Gruul. It's rarely about playing the best deck, especially if it's aggressive. It's always about how I want to kill it. So for me, I think Dimir Control would be my play style, and I would never feel bad playing that deck. But I think Mono Green Food is a better call if you're going to hard target that as the winner's metagame. So if you're certain about your read and you think that Gruul is still going to be over 20% of the meta, I think that Mono Green Food is the best deck to pick.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting because, like, for me, the Arjuna ethos would be on running Temur Ramp. That's definitely the most me style of deck out of all of these decks here. But I would not sleeve that up for this tournament. I think it's a powerful deck, and it took down the CFB Pro Challenge, I want to say. So definitely a deck that can get there. But I just feel like Teemo Ramp is a little bit too easy to exploit. And I feel like it's a bit too swingy. It's lacking some of these cards that I think have smoothed out Ramp in the past, such as Nissa, right? Cards that can just end up being an alternate win con or kind of get out of jail free cards like Krasis. So yeah, that wouldn't be my first place to go. I honestly, if I were going to play in this tournament, I think I would. It's actually interesting. I think I would probably choose a Dimir strategy. I'd probably just go for one of the Rogues deck. I still think that like Rogues is very strong. And I just think that it has the tools to fight on so many different axes. And maybe it's getting spread a little thin now, trying to keep up with all of these different archetypes. But I don't know. I think Rogues is still a very, very strong deck that could easily take down a tournament.
I think that's a good choice because I think the nastiest predators for Rogues, like Esper, Doom Foretold, Mono Red Aggro, and Rakdos Midrange, I don't think those are going to be popular at all.
Yeah. Yep. That's my thought too. I feel like, here's the thing, I feel like Rogues can hang in a winner's meta. That's what I feel like. Whereas I feel like some of these other decks are like, you know, the kind of decks that can make day 2, the kind of decks that can make top 8, but which might get a little bit picked apart by like, you know, like a level 3 deck played by a really good player.
What would you play in Historic?
Yeah, what would I play in Historic? Man, if I really wanted to win, yeah, it's boring, but it probably would be Sultai.
Wow. I thought... So, I feel like our roles are totally reversed this week because I would flip a coin for Rakdos or Blue-White Auras. I think they're both so powerful and proactive, and they both have this weird tension between each other where it's like Auras can't beat Priest, but Goblins can't beat Mayhem Devil, but Rakdos can't beat, like, can just kind of get run over. Hushbringer is a card, you know, and Yasharn is a card. So, I don't know, man.
I feel like Rakdos is probably the deck I would pick, like the absolute sweatiest choice. I just know that I wouldn't be able to pilot it, you know? I'm no Croakies, you know what I mean? So I feel like that the Sultai, the 4-color is, I'm not saying it's a less skill intensive deck by any means. It actually, in some ways, you know, has its own share of difficult decisions, but I just think I'd be a little bit better suited to pilot that deck, and I do think it can go all the way.
Yeah, I hear you on the Rakdos thing. I'm terrible at playing anything with a Claim the Firstborn in it.
We've all been there. Suffice it to say, very, very high skill ceiling for the deck. All right, well, those are our hot takes for the tournament. I hope that you guys tune in. I know that CGB and I definitely will be, and we'll be excited to discuss it the next time we're able to do so. So, yeah, take it on out. This podcast is brought to you by Arjuna and Covert Go Blue, the ArenaCraft podcast. You can find us basically everywhere you might want to. We're on Spotify or on most of probably all of the podcast platforms. We are on YouTube. Go ahead and give us a comment in the YouTube comments if you feel like, you know, we're flagrantly missing important aspects of the meta that you wanted to hear discussed on the show. I really enjoy that kind of feedback, actually. Not an invitation for abuse, but definitely an invitation for you to tell us what's working and what's not. Covert Go Blue, on the other hand, doesn't want to hear your crap, so don't don't go hassle.
He's right.
Don't go hassle him on his YouTube, but do go and watch his YouTube, CGB, Covert Go Blue, happening on the YouTube. And you can also watch him stream Monday through Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, CGB, have a rockin' weekend, and I'll catch you next time.
Later. But the three decks I really...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, you.
I was just going to make some bullshit comment that I'm probably going to edit out, so...
Oh, okay. Well, we have to keep this in. Like we can't take that out. People need to know. They need to know the truth. All right.
The truth about Arjuna.